one of the odd things that we did when we were putting together this group of speakers was to actually try to get speakers who would talk about different topics in different ways and not actually try to find connections. We actually tried, you know, when you put together a symposium or something, often you sort of get three perspectives on the same topic, and we tried hard to avoid that. So now that we're going to do a discussion, we're going to try and see if we can find connections. I'd like to invite you to think for a moment. If you could come up with a question or something that's arisen out of today that you could ask that might apply perhaps to two or maybe all three of our speakers. And while you're sort of considering, I will take the chair's privilege and ask the first question, which Susanna, in some ways, set up for me. She made a big point about paradigm, and you know, we talked about the scientific revolution and the big change that came out, and she made the prediction that in 200 years or something we'll have another meeting here and we'll be pointing to science, or as sort of with the same disdain that she used for alchemy. And I want to suggest that perhaps given what Indy made a comment on this morning, Susanna set up science for us as something that is testable. You form a hypothesis and you set up an experiment that you tested or try to prove it wrong. It's repeatable. And we talked about laws, that you formulate a limited number of laws. And what I understand from ecology, particularly from a comment that Indy made, that it's not repeatable. I mean, we can't do the 88 fires from Yellowstone. That a lot of it is not testable. You can't formulate a hypothesis and then go out and do an experiment in the same way. And I don't know, are there laws? Anyway, could a couple of you respond to that question?
Yeah, to me, the most important law is the law of unintended consequences. I don't think this thing works.
It does.
Oh, it does? Okay. So, I mean, so if we know that there's a lot of connections among organisms in systems and that they're strongly connected to the physical environment, what we also know is we can't just change one thing, and that other things will change. And I think that's a law.
What about the other? I guess part of my question here is also, is this a new mode of doing science? I mean, are we moving out of experiments, hypotheses, et cetera, to some other way of doing science?
Yeah, well, I really do think so. I think that regional work, global work, anything that has long time scales or large spatial scales or a great deal of complexity involved, we can't use what we think of as the classic experimental method.
Yeah, and just to further pick on this philosophy of science, it's actually historically been the philosophy of physics.
Yes.
And what we see emerging now is some really good work on philosophy of ecology and philosophy of biology, and it appears that we might be entering a realm where we talk about the philosophies of sciences, and that maybe science as some sort of gigantic umbrella of understanding that somehow includes something that is necessary and sufficient across all of these various ways of knowing that we call science, may be a losing venture, and it may be a fool's errand to try to reduce all the sciences to a common set of necessary and sufficient principles or methods or activities. And so I see the emergence of pluralism within science as perhaps, if there's going to be an overarching, perhaps that's the coming revolution.
Are there going to be shared assumptions? Are there going to be shared assumptions, though, even with these various sciences? What has to be shared in terms of an assumption in order for it to be a science?
Well, Susanna, I'd refer to Wittgenstein's family resemblances here.
Okay.
Right? I think, so Wittgenstein said, suppose you had three things, and thing one had qualities A, B, and C, and thing two had qualities B, C, and D, and thing three had qualities B, E, and F, or whatever the hell it is. I mean, what he was pointing out is that things 1 and 3 may actually not share any qualities in common except through the existence of the qualities of object 2. Right? So there's nothing that makes all of these things, there's no necessary and sufficient set of conditions such that all of these things have these conditions and therefore they all belong together. Okay? And so I think the sciences may be of that sort, that there may not actually be a single shared assumption across all the sciences, but there may be a series of assumptions or a series of principles that unite the sciences collectively, even though there's nothing that every single one of them must and necessarily has.
Except perhaps the desire to understand the world.
That's a little loose, but yeah.
Just give me something.
Give me something.
But related to that, I think there's something about the role of scientists in society and the role of professors in arenas like this that's come up that's sort of interesting. I mean, for me, I was pretty comfortable talking about what I know and what I don't know, and when we got to what do you feel about things, then I felt that's where I say that's not science anymore, and that's beyond it's almost not ethical for me to stand up here wearing my she's a professor hat and answer that question, just so you know. I mean, I do think that there's a difference between science as it's done and then the other part of who we are, which is the religion, which is the feelings, which is the values component.
Also, there is no value-free science. All science brings a huge set of values with it.
Or, as Nelson Goodman said, there's no such thing as a view from nowhere.
True.
Right? We always have a perspective. The myth of objectivity is a very dangerous myth.
Theory-laden observation. Every observation comes with a whole set of theory behind it, or you wouldn't be able to form the idea that you were seeing what it is you think you're seeing.
Yeah.
We're philosophers.
Okay, I see some people who want to ask some questions. Stan, can I start with you?
I guess I was struck mostly when Susan was talking about how the human thought process has, in a sense, changed relatively little from ancient times to present times. There was the desire to know what is and why is, and as we went down through the age of alchemy, and they were looking for the solution. And then you come to some of whom we consider the greatest scientists, and they use some of the same leaps of faith or thinking, say for example, Einstein or Bohr, when they submitted their theories. I mean, they didn't do it in the confines of the laboratory, and much as you said, some things are untestable, and that perhaps there were certain things that happened in a linear accelerator that made what Einstein said just off the top of his head seem for sure this is a reality. It may be tested. But the thought process was the same, going back to essences and relativity.
One of the elements of the scientific method, I mean, there's all these steps you go through that are the scientific method. One of the steps is create the hypothesis to be tested. And it turns out to create the hypothesis is an act of creativity. And this is where if you just have students with their heads packed full of information, they can't be scientists, because the good scientists have to have an act of creativity. I mean, how do you come up with what it is you're going to do? You have to form it. But it all goes back, there's a wonderful quotation that wisdom begins in wonder. But everything begins a wonder. It's the creativity, it's the questioning. That hasn't changed, and I think that may be, now I'm going to make a huge pronouncement, that may be universal human nature. I don't know.
Did I see a question over here?
I had sort of a comment, really. You had a premise that some things aren't testable based on, is it Indy you go by? Because it's Ingrid on the sheet. Okay, anyway, about not being able to test or experiment or whatever, and I take issue with that because what's really going on is when the experiment you were going to run that Indy is referred to would take several hundred years to run. It's awfully difficult to set up the experiment, but it could have been run. And then also there's an issue of modeling of things. The scientific community models this and models that. And you see talking heads on TV that talk about what the model says. I learned something about models. I was stationed on a ship out of Guam where we pay a lot of attention to typhoons because we were at latitude 8. They tend to run right over us. And you didn't want to be there when that happened. Well, the weather center wasn't very far from me. And so if something was perking, I would go over to the weather center to see what was going on. And they had about, 15 models of what typhoons will do. And you didn't have to worry. As long as models were going all sorts of different ways, you didn't have to worry about the typhoon because it wasn't doing very much. But when they all came together, it's time to worry because then something's going on. And so we sometimes can put an inordinate faith in models that is perhaps not warranted sometimes. So, that's why I take issue with what the premise you put out.
Yeah, I think of models, by the way, as hypotheses, as complex hypotheses that embed a large number of assumptions in them. And that's the same thing the global change community does, is take a lot of models, and when they all line up, that's where the certainty comes from. But it's this idea that we're doing science in a really different way, and if all those models share all the same assumptions, you're only testing, you're not testing all the variability and everything. And I don't think we can do an experiment at the global scale, because the way we talk about them with controls and replicates.
The limits of the human being is my point.
Well, and I don't know how many Earths there are.
Somebody does.
Well, see, even at smaller scales, though, I mean, to drag Hume into this and the problem of induction, I mean, the 88 fires, there's another Yellowstone, right? But it's not the Yellowstone that existed in 1987. I mean, one of the problems of induction is that the world stays the way it is, right? And if the world stays still, then repeatability becomes plausible. But at the sorts of, even at moderate spatiotemporal scales in ecology, the world doesn't hold still. So you don't even have to go to the scale of the Earth, I think, to get non-repeatability by virtue of the underlying reality changing. And then we're in trouble.
So let me muddy the waters by putting on my historian's hat and say, of course, that's the problem with doing history as a historian, is that, yes, you can have wars, and yes, people can get murdered, et cetera, but there's always differences in circumstances, perhaps differences in geography or population densities. So the historian is always dealing with the problem that they're trying to write about events that are non-repeatable. So what we saying is that something like ecology is becoming much more like a history, which means it's becoming sort of a humanities? That's a plug, Marcia. Okay, question here in the middle first, and then we'll...
This is for Ingrid, I think. The distinction between what we know and what we care about, I think that's kind of a false distinction, although I can see where it comes from. But there are probably a number of issues related to, wildlife policy in Wyoming or wherever, where I would really want to know what you felt or what you believe, because you would have given some basic level of what you care about. There are different levels of what you care about. And very specific things that you care about would be based on a kind of expertise that you have. So a lot of us, certainly I don't have. So I think that carings can be very, very specific, and they can utilize an awful lot of knowledge, where people like you are the ones that at least I would want to talk with. I'm happy to talk with other people too. Yeah. But if it carries a particular kind of thing, you can't really just separate what you know and what you care about.
I agree with you in part, but I feel as though when a public is listening really carefully, or a class of freshmen is listening really carefully to you, that it's incumbent upon me to say, here's what I know. Now, if I'm going to profess an opinion, here's what I feel about it. And I remember seeing Paul Ehrlich, the famous Paul Ehrlich, who's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, standing in a movie, you know, and he had his National Academy of Sciences hat on, and I think many of his sentences said, "we should," and that concerned me. Had he no credentials at all, I wouldn't have listened at all, that's true. He has a lot of credentials, so I listened more carefully, but I think if we're going to maintain credibility as scientists, the public needs to know when we're talking from our hearts or from our heads. No, not completely, but I try to be squeaky clean about it.
Sure. I was interested in your first observations along the lines that each branch of science is now developing its own philosophy, and they're not congruent necessarily. I was under the impression that the Holy Grail is still finding the theory of everything, and that people are really concentrating on that, or just because they haven't figured out how to get the high-energy physics with the Genome Project yet. That's still what they're trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, one of the concerns I have with the theory of everything is that it's silly, in the sense that even the physicists who are working on this theory of everything don't believe it's a theory of everything. It's a really nice hook for the media. I mean, there's no physicist who I know of who's going to suggest that if they get the theory of everything, they'll be able to tell us where the next snowflake will fall in Jackson. I mean, if it was a theory of everything, right, it ought to be able, not only that, it should be able to tell me what I think about the next snowflake falling in Jackson, if it's a theory of everything. And so the theory of everything is not a theory of everything. As a matter of fact, the theory of everything is just a theory of really teeny stuff. And I think widely in the sciences now, the notion of emergence, right, is clearly taken hold. It certainly has in the ecological sciences. The notion that certain phenomena can neither be explained nor predicted from a complete understanding of lower level phenomena. And it's actually the physicists, interesting enough, who are some of the first to catch on to this. There's a famous paper in Science called Big is Different. And the fellow said, you know, a complete understanding of hydrogen and oxygen doesn't allow me to predict that water would go down a hole in a whirlpool. That's an emergent phenomenon of water, which is not reducible to the properties of hydrogen and oxygen. So this notion of emergence, which can make some people nervous because it kind of has this ghostly feel, and it refers back to some of the history of science. So we get anxious about this as scientists. Uh-oh, is this God sneaking in again? Is actually I think an increasingly widely accepted notion in terms of the complexity sciences. I mean, chaos, the notion of the emergence of strong or strange attractors, that's not built into the original equations. We're seeing it more and more. And I think it's maybe some of this ecological revolution of more holistic and less reductionistic approaches to our understanding.
Let me just add back to models about this. Models, our philosophy of models in science, I think, is really variable across disciplines. And you know, as someone who wants to watch knowledge progress, I think it's critical that we pay close attention when our models fail, because that's when we learn, we were wrong. And too much right now, I feel as though the sciences are going towards predicting a future and making sure the models are right, and tuning them and tinkering them until they do the best job. And I would love to see a more rigorous approach to models in science and thinking about them as hypotheses that we hope will fail so we can learn something new.
And I would just say, when you have anything like the theory of everything, be aware of the incredible assumptions that are going on there, as if reality is ever going to be that simple. The idea that things are, in fact, connected is a huge assumption, and as far as I can tell, there's no evidence for that assumption.
The question arises when we think about progress. To what extent is progress possible without objective verification, or the ability to have objective verification?
Well, I mean, my philosophical predispositions are toward the American pragmatists, so that in that case, what we know is we're making progress is if the effects we're having in the world are lessening human suffering. The notion of progress toward getting to some absolute truth, some sort of Platonic notion, is very problematical philosophically, because the claim of making progress presumes that you know you're getting closer to something. You don't know if you're getting closer to it unless you know what it is. If you know what it is, why don't you just do it? All right? So the problem with this notion of scientific progress as an approximation of some sort of objective truth is deeply problematical, which...
How do you evaluate the benefit of avoiding suffering?
I think that becomes axiomatic in the sense of we don't like to suffer, therefore having less of it seems like a good thing. This is called the harm principle in ethics. It's a starting point. If there are people out there who somehow don't get that suffering is a bad thing, then there's no way to really talk them into that. And so no matter where you are in science or philosophy or history, you can push it back, and eventually you get to first principles, your axiomatic stand, right? And beyond that, which in a sense unites all of these fields with regard to eventually having to take a position that might be perceived as being an act of faith. We take it as given that, and that's where we start. And all of us have to start somewhere. And sciences, history, whatever it is, there's a starting point. And so suffering might be the starting point for the pragmatist. A physical reality and a non-supernatural explanation is a good starting point for the sciences. But we all have a starting point. It just depends on what, I think there is progress insofar as I think there is good empirical evidence that the world today has less human suffering than it did 1,000 years ago. In fact, we're less likely now to die at the violent death at the hands of another human than we've ever been in history.
Or an insect?
Yeah, we're doing a little better there too. So measuring, progress. To claim progress first requires us to say what is it that we are working toward, and once we know what that toward is, we can claim whether or not we've made progress. If the toward is an absolute understanding of objective truth, it's a little problematical, which is why I like to frame it in terms that I think are more sort of empirically accessible, which is well-being.
I'm going to give a shot at it, even though I didn't give a talk today. Just to expand a little bit on what Jeff was saying, progress is progress by what measure? And it's like saying to giving your students a problem that says, what is improvement? Has humankind improved? And the first thing a student will do, because we've taught them through high school and through colleges, they will set down their definition of improvement. And, it may be a very narrow definition, it may be a very large definition, but then they will try and answer it that way. And it's, in a sense, the progress question, much broader, much more philosophically widespread, is also a question of progress in what? In health, in long life, in sending a person to the moon. We can come up with a whole bunch of things. Jeff talks about lack of suffering. I think that's a good one. My personal one has to do with tolerance and getting along, which I suppose is a variation on what Jeff has said. And that feeds into my own career as an academic, in that I try to explain things that sometimes get people angry and help them understand, in the belief that understanding leads to a tolerance and less conflict. That happens to be a very quick potted version of a personal philosophy, but I think it also sort of gives you a sense of an answer to that question. I think you were first.
I have a question. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but let's go back to Hitler and eugenics, building the master race, the science of perfecting humans as being extremely strong and sturdy and possibly less prone to disease because of selective breeding and those kinds of things. Well, I guess my question is, what if he had won the war and the world suddenly was thrust into, this is the right idea because he won, and history's always written by the winners. How do you see something like that having, unfolding across the years? Because that would be a paradigm, correct? That there can be a master race, that humans can be genetically manipulated towards perfection. How would we climb out of that paradigm? Would the ecology be better off? Because there would be fewer human beings on Earth. The sick and the infirm would not be allowed to reproduce, so there would be less draw on the resources that we all use. So how, what might have happened if he had won?
Okay, well,
Go ahead.
one of the things that I do when I get on an airplane often is I read science fiction. This sounds like a science fiction what if question. I mean, even if you start with that scenario, in fact, there are a number of science fiction writers that have done some version of that. And what often winds up playing out is one of two directions. If you fine-tune a race of human beings at the expense of all the others to be disease-free to certain things, that usually means they're more susceptible to some other disease. So they get caught from the side. The other science fiction approach to that would probably revolve around the notion of genes, and how even as you're breeding for dominant genes, recessive genes will actually carry the negative qualities, and you can't breed them out in that way. So in the end, making a super race is a nice political, politicians, plan to get people riled up for. But I think it may, in the end, have proved to be impossible to achieve. That's, at least as a science fiction writer wannabe, that's where I would go with it. Stan, you had your hand up.
I was just thinking when Jeff talked about progress, his definition of progress, in my mind, to some extent, it can be counterproductive. I mean, if you wipe out all disease, or at least decrease disease and war and famine and pestilence and so forth, and that, of course, would lead to overpopulation, which would lead to more greenhouse gases. And in some ways, is that progress? Is that progress for the planet, or is that just a definition of progress?
Well, in a sense, if the minimization of immediate human suffering causes a tremendous future human suffering, that in fact we haven't in fact reduced suffering. I mean, the pragmatists were very clear that our immediate needs may not be genuine, in the sense that they didn't think that people were a heroin addict was actually better off if you gave him heroin, right? That immediate right, the satisfaction of a bodily desire. And this kind of goes back to the virtue theorist too, right, that it's not a genuine good, right? And so the reference to suffering, which is interesting because I think it arises, this notion of the genuine good arises both in the East and in the West, that there is something that is genuinely good, and that the pursuit of that is what we ought to be after. I mean, was it Bhutan's new constitution has gross national happiness as one of the conditions that has to be maximized, right? We have gross national product. They have this notion of gross national happiness. To me, that sounds like progress in a sense, right? So the amount of crap we have is not the index of progress necessarily. It's whether the crap we have is making us any better off, in which case, in some cases, it's clearly not. And so getting clear on what's going to constitute this happiness and suffering thing, and having lots of stuff, right, may not be, that may be the equivalent of giving the heroin addict, right, some more drugs. And for us as a society, I suspect that our drug is material wealth, and that you're right, that we've substituted and made a mistake about what's going to constitute the reduction of suffering, and that is leading long lives full of lots of stuff. And so, yeah, I would actually say that we can be mistaken about what we judge to be happiness and the well-being, because we might have a short-term or some sort of a misunderstanding of of actual sources of our happiness.
When I teach utilitarianism is the greatest happiness principle, happiness being a technical term, and basically it's more of the good is better than less of the good. It's like, yeah. And then you have to define the good, and that's where all of this discussion about progress comes in. And utilitarians have now been arguing about what is the good for 300 or 400 years, 300 years. Yeah. And when I teach this to my students, I don't want them getting bogged down into all these different theories of the good. And so what I tell my students is the good is whatever it is that you need, so that as you're dying, you lay in bed and you think, I got it right. Whatever that is, that's the good.
Just a quick question. I spent my life in a grade school, and I teach art, and I'm seeing so many changes. I mean, I've been a teacher for 35 years now, and we're teaching to the test, and we're government. We have to pass a test, and the school I'm in right now hasn't passed that test, so they're cutting back all the creativity stuff, like less art, less music, less gym class, less recess, and really cramming down their throats reading, writing, and arithmetic. And it's just horrifying me because it's a fast day, and the kids never get a chance to talk, philosophize, question. Because of this new government mandate, No Child Left Behind, we are leaving the really sharp kids behind, because we are trying to pick up every darn disability and drag it along at the same speed that the upper kids or the smarter kids are going along at. And I don't know, I'm becoming disillusioned with education, after a long history of thinking I could get in there and change things. But it's been wonderful today to listen to people actually talk about things that are really important. And I would love to have our elementary schools be able to get back to that instead of just trying to pass a test, even when you're Hispanic and you've only been in America 1 year and you're supposed to read at the same level, and your school gets cut down and government funds get cut. I mean, it's just, it seems so bizarre that we've gone in this direction.
The good is when you get it right. The bad is assessment from administrators.
Well, last month there was an article in Harper's, right, that talked about the domination both of society and of educational institutions by math and science. in terms of resources. And I think it's a domination in terms as well of our educational system with regard to these benchmarks and standards. There, as far as I know, there are very few sorts of expectations of what our students are going to be able to think about, right? But there's these sort of, and I think math and science are fantastically important. And to be scientifically illiterate is to be put in an extraordinarily dangerous situation in our society, because if you can't make critical decisions in a scientific context, you're at a tremendous disadvantage. And math illiteracy puts you at a tremendous, you look at the number of students who get in debt because they can't sort of anticipate or forecast a compound interest, right? And so those things are terribly important, but to the extent that they're done to the exclusion of some of the practices that are more common in the humanities, I think is undermining the educational system. And I don't see these as, the crazy part is it's not either or, as if creative thinking was something that was going to happen in the arts, right? Or in the humanities, and by golly, the scientists don't need that. They just need to be able to solve problems without putting them into context or coming up with anything original. And so this either-orness between well, and actually it's arts and humanities and sciences is a crazy dichotomy. And I think it's a destructive dichotomy. And how we get over it is very difficult to say. A lot of it's harder to measure. So we measure the easy stuff. I mean, that's kind of like what science does, right? The hard stuff is hard to measure. So we tend to focus on the easy stuff to measure. And we all know if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist.
That could get you two going for hours.
Okay. One last question.
Maybe I'm just a little bit confused of, so you said philosophy, science, and religion, of course, three different disciplines, three different things. And I'm just curious about what the relations are between philosophy as a separate area, separate field, and science. And in terms of how fast the human mind can process or not process the things that the scientists are discovering. In terms of, I believe that was also Wittgenstein who said that philosophy in the contemporary times is mostly about the language. It analyzes the language. And so how is philosophy catching up? Is it in terms of like philosophy as aesthetics? Do that make sense? I'm Russian, so sometimes that don't make sense.
So I think she wants to know if your field is progressing. Is that right?
Sort of, yeah. What are the relations between the science and philosophy? Do they help each other? How do they synthesize to help, public to process what's going on in the
Well, certainly there's interaction between science and philosophy all the time, and that's within the field of philosophy of science. And so the philosophy of scientists kind of look at what science is doing, and if the scientists listen to the philosophers of science, they kind of see things differently, and the hope then is progress is made. But also then the philosophers need stuff to think about and look at, and we get that from looking at the new things that are being done in science, and that changes radically how we think about how the mind works. I mean, it used to be theories of the mind were Descartes and dualism, and now we've got cognitive psychology and all this information we get from the sciences of neurobiology, et cetera, and that has changed radically theories of epistemology and philosophy of mind. So it's not that one is off doing something and the other one's just trying to look at it. They're actually feeding off each other on a constant basis to the benefit of both disciplines. Did that answer the question?
Well, I just want to sort of break down a little bit this notion that somehow science and religion have now occupied non-overlapping magisteria, as Stephen Jay Gould called them. I mean, the fact that we care about the earth, right, in Western society, right, and we're worried about this is richly grounded in in this long Christian tradition, right? We still use within science, right, words like stewardship, right, which we're borrowing right out of the Old Testament. We use terms like ecosystem, which is a metaphorical way of structuring the world as if nature was some sort of machine or had mechanisms, right? And that goes back to the notions that came out of Christianity, that the world was designed, that it had intentionality, and that there is a system, right? I mean, we call it an ecosystem because we think it's a system, right? And so the idea that we've somehow managed to draw this bright line historically, right? We're living with the legacies of having arisen out of a particular cultural and historical context. And science is embedded in culture, and it's embedded in European culture, it's embedded in the West in a Christian culture. And so the notion that we're done with that, right, and somehow science is now free of those influences, I think is really a false assertion. I think what we want to do is be keenly aware of them, right? But and I actually think there's now some much more interesting dialogue going on, especially in environmental issues, right? The major world religions and science seem to be talking about what the future of the world is going to look like. And scientists are realizing that facts don't motivate a lot of people, right? And the reality is, if we want to change the way people behave, we're going to have to appeal to the stuff that matters to them. And the stuff that matters to a lot of people is not a graph, right? You got to get the graph, right? You got to know what's happening, right? But I've never seen anyone go racing out of the room going, I'm going to change my life. I've seen a graph, right? What they do is they take that graph and they embed it in a set of values, the stuff that's important to them, right? The future generations, right? Species. Why do we care about species? Most of them could go away. They are going away, right? Because we think they have some importance, right? And some importance other than this utilitarian importance. No?
Jeff's point is what I meant when I said science is never free of value. That we bring all of this to science and we do what we do in science based on what we think is important and the values we have. And that's what I meant. So Jeff said it. Do you want to defend your graphs?
I love them. That's all I can say.
She has a love of graphs. It's an emotional response, an aesthetic. You find them pleasing, beautiful. Thank you.
Just to, you know, Susanna was talking about things getting muddied if you went on too long. Let me just add one closing thought. With the close of alchemy, the word telos dropped off of Susanna's graph. But it hasn't disappeared. We still think that things should have a purpose. We as human beings think that things should have a purpose. But science often, usually, never talks about purpose. Purpose is something that is determined by human beings, etc. I mean, what should we do with, you know, things like the knowledge of increasing CO2 emissions and so on? Those choices are human choices that are made on religious grounds, on grounds of values, on grounds of, you know, wanting to allow our children to breathe, and things like, all of which can be seen as emotional, as spiritual, as humanistic, but they don't tend to be scientific. So science has a very good and important place in our society, but it doesn't tell us what to do with the information it gives us. And we, as responsible citizens of our countries, of our communities, of our families, those are our decisions. And oh God, I'm sounding like a preacher. Oh, a parent. Yeah, thank you. Okay.
Jeff has, what's the quote we keep using? Science without ethics?
I'm working on it. Well, actually, it was.
You made it up.
Oh, the one we made up?
Yeah.
Oh. It was actually, it's an adaptation. It's a very old quote that's been used by various people. And it originally was done with science and religion, I believe, right? That science without religion is blind. Religion without science is lame. In other words, if you have values and you don't know how to enact them in the world, then you're ineffective. But if all you know is how to do things in the world, but you don't know which things you ought to be doing, right? Then you're acting blindly. And
you need science and ethics together.
Because you can't get from the way the world is to the way the world it ought to be.
Okay, I think on that note, I think we will draw things to a close. I thank everybody who's helped organize it, and I thank all of you for coming and listening.